When I started writing this talk, I called myself a pantheist. That is, God is everything and everything is God. However, as I often do, my first step for writing this talk was to make sure I actually understand the words I'm using before I start bantering them about. And I realized that by the standard definitions of pantheist, that in the context of talking about God spiritually, the term I really actually mean when I'm saying the word pantheist is panentheist. The word pantheist is basically a scientific term, mathematical almost. It is defined to mean that a person believes that everything that exists combined is what God is. Some people use the word universe as in the entire universe is what makes up God. But this word can be confusing. When I use the word universe, I mean everything that exists. But most people mean everything we humans see and perceive. This view makes arguing against the idea of pantheism easier. But it isn't actually the definition. Pan means all. Pan is everything, not just what we decide to put in it. It means God is everything. So for the sake of this talk, when I use the word universe, I mean the matter and energy that we generally think of as the universe. There's no spirituality stated or implied in the word pantheist. It doesn't mean that God is or has a spirit, or that God can or does control anything. It does not even mean that God has a consciousness. It doesn't define that none of these exists either. It simply does not say. That is not what the word is describing. It only means that one believes that God is everything and everything is God. If you believe that, and you happen to believe that God is spirit and that God is an omnipotent consciousness, then you are a pantheist. But you're also a pantheist if you believe that everything that exists combined is what defines God, but you do not believe that the sum of all parts is aware. It's simply not part of the definition of pantheist. Panentheism, however, does define that. A panentheist believes that God is everything and everything is God, but also believes that God transcends what we think of as the universe, the matter and energy that makes up the physical world as we know it. God is more than what we humans can see or perceive, more even than we can imagine. God is things like good and spirit and all-knowing. We, the earth, the stars, and all that we know of the universe, or will ever know, is what God created. But it is not all that there is. If we, and the earth, and the stars, and all that God created was to stop existing, God would still exist. God's creation is in God, but God is more. This is pretty much how I understand the view of the Unity Church, something I just learned last month in Shiloh's seminar, how fortuitously timed since I was already writing this talk. I never much directly thought about God from this point of view. God is everything, everything is God. That makes sense to me. How else can it be? I took this view for granted earlier than I can remember. And since churches don't often talk about it in this way, I didn't even realize that the first two principles of unity, that is, God is the essence of all and the essence of God is within us, makes unity an outlier. I just somehow assumed that most people and all churches thought that God is everything, not something separate from it. I didn't realize, in fact, until I was writing this talk and I started directly asking what different religious organizations think of the concept of pantheism. And I learned that the church decidedly did not think of God this way. I found that in nearly every major sect, in every church of the book, that is, religions that take the Old Testament as a holy book, the idea that everything is God and God is everything is in fact vehemently opposed. Even if one is using the term pantheism and you are defining God as a divine, omnipotent, aware, loving, good God. The doctrine in nearly all sects of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, of course there are a few outliers like unity in all the religions, is that God is separate from God's creation. We are not part of God. God is not part of us. God created us out of nothing and exists the same as God existed before the creation. Now, you all probably already know that I don't think humans can actually understand God. Even me. Imagine that. So I'm not trying to tell you how it is. I'm only talking about what makes sense to me, what feels right to me, and why I think it's a reasonable way to think. But Lordy, turns out this point of view is out of step with, well, most everyone. There are a number of reasons that religious leaders give for almost universally denying the idea that God and God's creation, including us, are inherently one. But the reasons are not ones that I find compelling. One is the idea that since living things, and even planets and stars, are subject to constant change and decay, that if God is everything, then God is always changing and decaying. But God is perfect and unchanging. So if God is and a decaying star are the same, then God would not be God. But I don't see how that follows. Everything we can see in the universe is, in fact, constantly changing. But while things look very volatile from our little 80-odd year lives, overall, nothing is added or subtracted. First law of the universe, folks. All this so-called change is just cycles. Like the moon is not enhanced or diminished as it waxes and wanes in the sky, so the totality of what we call the universe is neither more nor less after a supernova than it was before. The constant changing, growing, living, and dying of humans does not change the everything, and certainly does not change God. Another common one is that the world contains many points where it is lacking, especially when one is talking about humans. If the wholeness of God includes we imperfect humans, then God would be imperfect. And again, if God contains imperfections, then God is not God. There can be no lacking in God. So to this I counter, who says we're not perfect? We don't know what perfect is in the eyes of God, or what God's plan is, or why God may do what God does. We may have lacking from the point of view of some other human, but that human does not know the sum of all things that we are. We don't even know that. Only God does. I also think that any infestation of imperfections between us and God goes the other way. Any lacking that we have can't diminish God. Sort of like what Jesus told his followers about things unclean, that the unclean thing does not foul the clean. Only things from inside can spoil you. The good contacting the soil spreads the good to the soiled, not the other way around. So, if you do count us humans as imperfect and lacking, then all that could possibly happen by us being one with God is that our lacking would be filled in by God. God, after all, is infinite. There is always enough juice to go around. So as far as I can figure, if we are one with God, then we all have perfect souls. Another point made is that there is no thou unless we have an I separate from thou. You cannot pray to, be judged by, or have any kind of relationship with a God to which you are a structural part. Only separation, distinctness can allow that. Well, I have a bunch of problems with this one. The first being, why not? I have conversations with myself all the time. And I think everyone would agree that I'm me. I don't need to be separate from myself to have a relationship with myself. I also have a problem with the impression that that point of view seems to be trying to dictate to me what kind of relationship I have with God. We all have our own relationship with God, whether the outside world likes it or believes it or not. I also have a problem with the fact that demanding we consider ourselves to be separate from God requires that we have an interpreter for our relationship with God, sort of like the Egyptian pharaoh standing between the gods and the mortals. If we are part of God, if, in fact, the entirety of our being is made up of God, then we have a very direct relationship with God. Our having our own personal relationship with God diminishes the power of the church and the church leaders. If we need them to tell us how to pray, how to worship, and who God is and what God thinks, then we will always need them. I believe that we have a relationship with God that supersedes whatever the Pharisees and the scribes may tell us. And while Jesus definitely did not say that we are all part of God, he did make clear that the church leaders had a bad habit of interfering with the relationship we should have with God. But there is one reason I had to stop and think about. And that is that if everything is God, and God is everything, then that would include evil. And thus, God is evil. I believe God isn't evil. God is good. But I also think that God is everything. So how does this work? Brings up the question of, what is evil? No two sources are going to give you the same definition of the word evil. Different churches will also give different definitions related on their view of evil, sin, God, the devil, and hell. Pentecostals, evangelicals, and Catholics, for instance, have a strong tradition of an evil being who steals souls from God and works to bring evil into the world. These churches have a view of evil that it is a force in and of itself, diametrically opposed to good, aka Star Wars. And that God is the good, and the devil is the evil, and either you work with God to enhance good, or you work with the devil to create evil. This point of view really does make the idea that God is one with everything a bit difficult. But I, and unity too, by point of philosophy I recently learned, do not believe in evil as a force of itself. Evil to me is just a word to apply to acts and perpetrators that are bad, nasty, corrupt, cruel, destructive, etc., to a point where those words don't really seem harsh enough to describe it. I don't consider things without a consciousness capable of evil. A star is not evil for exploding. even if the explosion happened to kill billions of aware beings. A cat is not evil for toying with its prey, as it does not know that it is causing suffering. Starvation, cancer, murder, miscarriage, earthquakes, and the like, while horrible, are not evil. They just are. And even people who act in ways that get described as evil, they are bad, and as a society, we need to deal with them in ways to protect ourselves. But I still do not see it as an evil, a force within itself. Rather, just a combination of things that made this person who they are, which happens to be really nasty. So all these ruminations on evil mean that I do not see this as a valid argument against the idea that we are part of God, and that the essence of God is within us. In fact, the fact that the moving parts of God's creation sometimes cause suffering to the living things within the creation does not make God evil. It doesn't make God anything. It simply is. Of course, there is the issue that all of the holy books do strongly suggest that we are not God and God is not us. And one might find that compelling in one's desire to find the right and true way of seeing the world. And I don't have much to say about that, so you each will have to decide on your own how much that affects your view on this. Because I do see this as a way of viewing the world. It's all just philosophical ruminations, and what philosophy one decides to adhere to often comes down to, how do I choose to look at it? Choosing a philosophical point of view is usually a question of what serves me. So that, in this case, would have me asking myself, does this point of view serve me? And for me, I come up with a resounding yes. I think that this point of view makes it easier to be comfortable in myself, easier to grasp the concept of God, easier to navigate the world, easier to have hope for the future. I don't see it as harming me. I don't suffer angst or guilt over it. I mean, why wouldn't I like the idea that I'm part of God? Keeps me from being alone, gives me strength when my own is lacking, connects me with that which is bigger than me, connects me with all those other humans that I may have a hard time connecting with personally, helps me believe that that which seems hopeless really isn't, helps me grapple with the idea that I am such a small, insignificant thing in such a huge, even infinite world around me, allows me to decide that this feeling of being out of control of, well, everything, is really just an illusion. Sure, we're part of the physical universe. I mean, we're really part of it. We're part of the mass and gravity of the Earth. We add heat to the galaxy. But being one with God, I am infinite. I am good. I am more than the cells that make up my body, more than the electrons and protons that give me mass. That connection, I mean connection as in being of the same essence as God, means that I'm connected, period. Blessed be. A couple of ushers, we will have a call for offerings.